The October rain drummed steadily against the windows of the old Victorian house on Elm Street in Cincinnati, Ohio. Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old retired librarian with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, carefully descended the creaky wooden stairs to the basement, her arthritic hands gripping the railing with each step. The musty smell of decades-old memories filled her nostrils as she switched on the dim overhead bulb, casting long shadows across boxes stacked like monuments to a lifetime lived. For months, she had been putting off this task, sorting through her late husband's belongings. Robert had passed away 6 months ago after a long battle with emphysema, leaving behind a lifetime of collected treasures that now felt more like burdens weighing down her heart. Baseball cards yellowed with age, old photographs with curled edges, newspaper clippings brittle as autumn leaves, and boxes upon boxes of what Robert had lovingly called his archives. The basement had become Robert's sanctuary during his retirement. He would spend hours down here, organizing his collection, reading old sports magazines, and writing in journals about his theories regarding baseball statistics and Cincinnati Reds history. Margaret had often found him here late at night, wearing his old reading glasses and muttering to himself about batting averages and pitching rotations. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek as she opened the first dusty cardboard box. Robert had been obsessed with Cincinnati Reds baseball since he was a boy, and his collection reflected that passion with religious devotion. Ticket stubs from games dating back to the 1970s, programs signed by forgotten players, photographs of himself at Riverfront Stadium wearing his lucky red cap that had faded to pink over the years, and scorecards filled out in his meticulous handwriting. "Oh, Robert," she whispered to herself, her voice echoing in the quiet basement. "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" The first box contained mostly programs and ticket stubs. Margaret smiled despite her sadness as she found tickets from games they had attended together during their courtship. Robert had been so nervous during their first date at a Reds game in 1974 that he had spilled mustard on his shirt and spent 3 innings apologizing. She had fallen in love with his earnestness that night. The second box held photographs and letters. Margaret found pictures of Robert as a young man, playing baseball in high school and American Legion ball. His father had died when Robert was only 14, and baseball had become his way of staying connected to memories of throwing catch in the backyard and dreaming of major league stardom. As she reached deeper into the third box, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, an envelope that felt different from the others. Unlike the yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs, this envelope was cream-colored and seemed to have been handled carefully over the years. The paper quality was expensive, heavier than typical correspondence. The return address made her heart skip a beat. P. Rose, Las Vegas, NV. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the envelope over. It was addressed to Robert Thompson, Cincinnati, OH. But there was no postmark. The envelope had never been mailed. Someone had written it with the intention of sending it, then kept it instead. The question was why. She carefully opened it, her heart pounding as she unfolded the handwritten letter inside. The paper was quality stationery, and the handwriting was bold and confident, the kind of script that belonged to someone accustomed to signing autographs. At the top, in elegant script, it read, "From the desk of Pete Rose. Dear Robert, I've been carrying this burden for too long, and I can't take it to my grave. You deserved to know the truth 30 years ago, but I was a coward. Your father, William Thompson, didn't die in that car accident like everyone told you. I was there that night, and what happened? It's time you knew. Your father was trying to help me. The gambling debts, the threats, it was all spiraling out of control. By 1989, I owed the wrong people more money than I could ever repay. These weren't bookies looking for a quick settlement. These were dangerous men who made examples of people who couldn't pay. Billy knew I was in trouble, and he offered to help me disappear for a while until things cooled down. We staged the accident, Robert. Your father went into hiding to protect both of us, but something went wrong. The men we were running from, they found out about the plan. They had connections everywhere. Cops, federal agents, people in the military who knew how to track someone who was trying to vanish. They got to your father before he could get to the safe house I had arranged in Kentucky. Robert, your father died protecting me, protecting my secret. He died a hero, but I never had the courage to tell you. He spoke of you constantly during those last few months. He was so proud of you, so proud of the man you were becoming. He showed me your high school graduation picture every time we met. He carried newspaper clippings about your baseball games in his wallet. In his final moments, he made me promise to look after you and your family. I tried, Robert. I tried to help from the shadows, but I could never find the courage to face you with the truth. I'm getting old now, and the weight of this secret is crushing me. Every sleepless night, every public appearance where fans cheer for me, I think about your father and what he sacrificed. You have a right to know what kind of man your father really was. He wasn't just a mechanic who died in a senseless accident. He was a man who sacrificed everything to help a friend in need, just like he had done in Vietnam when we first met. There's more, Robert. Your father left something for you. Something I've been holding all these years because I didn't know how to get it to you without revealing the truth. It's in a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Vegas, box 1421. The key is taped to the bottom of your old baseball trophy, the one from your Little League championship that I had delivered to your house anonymously in 1985. Your father saved that trophy from his own childhood belongings, and he wanted you to have it as a reminder of his love for you and the game. I know this letter will turn your world upside down, but you deserve to know the truth about William Thompson. You deserve to know that you come from a line of good men who do the right thing, even when it costs them everything. Your father didn't just die in some random accident. He died protecting someone he considered a brother, someone he had saved before in the jungles of Southeast Asia. I'm sorry, Robert. I'm sorry for being a coward all these years. I'm sorry your father paid the price for my mistakes. And I'm sorry you had to live your whole life not knowing what a hero your father really was. I hope someday you can forgive me. Your father's friend, Pete Rose, P.S. The anonymous help your family has received over the years, college tuition, mortgage payments, medical bills. That was me trying to honor your father's sacrifice. It was never charity. It was a debt I owed to the finest man I ever knew. Margaret's hand shook as she finished reading the letter. She read it again, then a third time, trying to process what she had discovered. Her husband, Robert, had died never knowing the truth about his father's death. He had spent his entire life believing his father was just an unlucky mechanic who died in a random car accident on a rainy night in November 1989. The letter explained so much that had never made sense. Margaret remembered Robert's stories about his childhood, how he had always felt something was off about his father's death. The police reports were vague, the details didn't quite add up, and there were too many unanswered questions that everyone seemed eager to avoid discussing. Robert's mother, Helen, had died in 1995, taking whatever secrets she might have known to her grave. She'd always been evasive when Robert asked about his father's final days, claiming her memory was too painful to revisit. Other relatives and family friends had similar reactions. They all insisted it was just a tragic accident, and that dwelling on it would only cause more pain. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, the letter clutched in her trembling hands. In the living room, she sat in Robert's favorite armchair, a worn leather recliner where he had spent countless evenings watching Reds games and reading baseball biographies. She stared at the rain-soaked window and tried to process this revelation that changed everything she thought she knew about her family's history. This letter explained so many mysteries that had puzzled them over the years. The anonymous gifts that had arrived like clockwork, college tuition money for their children that came from an anonymous benefactor who never revealed themselves, the mysterious check for $15,000 that had paid off their mortgage during Robert's unemployment in the early 1990s, the baseball memorabilia that kept appearing with no return address or explanation. She remembered Robert's confusion and gratitude whenever these gifts arrived. He would spend days trying to figure out who was helping them, calling relatives and friends, even hiring a private investigator once to trace the source of a particularly large donation. Nothing ever led anywhere. The money always came through legitimate channels, but the original source remained a mystery. Margaret thought about the old Little League trophy sitting on the mantelpiece. Robert had treasured it, not because it was particularly valuable. It was just a small plastic figure on a wooden base, but because it was one of the few tangible connections he had to his father, who had died when Robert was only 14. Robert had told her the story dozens of times, how his father had been so proud when 12-year-old Robert's team won the city championship, how William had promised to take him to see the Reds play as a reward, how that promise had never been fulfilled because of the accident 2 years later. With newfound determination, Margaret walked to the mantelpiece and carefully lifted the trophy. Sure enough, taped to the bottom was a small key, wrapped in aged Scotch tape. She peeled it away carefully, noting how the adhesive had yellowed with age but still held firm after all these years. Margaret's mind raced with questions and possibilities. Should she tell her children? Should she travel to Las Vegas to open the safety deposit box? What would Robert have wanted her to do? He had spent so many years searching for answers about his father's death. Would he have wanted to know this painful truth, or would he have preferred to keep believing in the simpler, less complicated story? She thought about Pete Rose, the man who had written this confession. She knew about his gambling problems, his ban from baseball, his fall from grace, but this letter revealed a different side of him, a man haunted by guilt, a man who had spent decades trying to atone for something that might not even have been his fault. Margaret picked up the phone and dialed her daughter Sarah's number. Sarah lived in Columbus with her husband and 2 teenage children, working as a high school English teacher. She had inherited her father's love of baseball and her mother's practical nature, but she also had a strength and decisiveness that sometimes surprised her mother. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was warm but concerned. It was unusual for Margaret to call in the middle of the afternoon. "Is everything okay? You sound upset." "Sarah, honey, I need you to come over. I found something in your father's things, something important." "What kind of something?" "Mom, you're scaring me." Margaret looked down at the letter in her lap, at the key in her palm, at the trophy that had been hiding secrets for decades. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about your grandfather, William." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah had heard her father's theories about his father's death, had listened to him wonder aloud about the inconsistencies in the official story. She had always assumed it was just grief and the natural human need to find meaning in tragedy. "I'll be there in 2 hours, Mom. Don't do anything until I get there, okay? And Mom, whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." As Margaret waited for Sarah to arrive, she found herself studying old photographs of Robert as a young man. There was one from his high school graduation, where he stood proudly in his cap and gown, smiling at the camera with his whole future ahead of him. He had his father's eyes, deep brown and serious, and his stubborn chin. William Thompson had been dead for 3 years by then, but Robert still looked like a young man who believed his father would have been proud of him. She found another photograph from Robert's wedding day in 1976. He was 25 then, handsome in his rented tuxedo, beaming as he held Margaret's hand. They had both wished his father could have been there to see him get married, to walk Margaret down the aisle in place of her own father, who had died 2 years earlier. Margaret realized that Robert had spent his whole life creating an image of William Thompson based on fragments and memories and the stories that other people were willing to tell. He had built an entire mythology around a father he had barely known as an adult, a man who had been frozen in time as the perfect dad who threw baseballs in the backyard and promised to take his son to see the Reds play. Now she held the truth in her hands, and she wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse. The truth was more complicated than the simple story they had always believed. William Thompson hadn't just been an unlucky victim of circumstance. He had been a war veteran, a loyal friend, and ultimately a man who had died trying to help someone he cared about. But the truth also came with pain. Pete Rose's gambling addiction had put William Thompson in danger. The heroic death that the letter described was still a senseless waste of life, a tragedy that could have been avoided if different choices had been made. Margaret walked to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, needing something to do with her hands while her mind processed everything she had learned. The familiar routine of measuring grounds and filling the pot with water helped calm her nerves. As she waited for the coffee to brew, she thought about Pete Rose, sitting somewhere in Las Vegas, carrying this secret for over 30 years. She tried to imagine what that guilt must have felt like, knowing that a good man had died because of your mistakes, then watching that man's family struggle while being too afraid to help openly. The coffee finished brewing just as she heard Sarah's car pull into the driveway. Margaret poured 2 cups and carried them to the living room, setting them on the coffee table next to the letter that would change everything they thought they knew about their family's history. Sarah Thompson Miller's Honda Civic splashed through the puddles in her mother's driveway as she hurried to park under the old maple tree. At 42, she had inherited her father's methodical nature and her mother's fierce loyalty to family. Her brown hair was streaked with premature gray, a testament to the stress of teaching high school English and raising 2 teenagers who seemed to speak an entirely different language than the one she taught. She had made the drive from Columbus to Cincinnati in record time, her mind racing with possibilities about what her mother might have discovered. The urgency in Margaret's voice had been unmistakable, and Sarah knew her mother well enough to understand that whatever she had found was significant enough to warrant an immediate family meeting. She found her mother sitting in the same chair where she had been 2 hours earlier, the mysterious letter still in her lap, the coffee growing cold on the table. Margaret's face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. The sight of her strong, practical mother looking so shaken immediately put Sarah on high alert. "Mum, what's going on?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the chair and taking her mother's free hand. Margaret's fingers were ice cold despite the warm house. Without a word, Margaret handed her the letter. Sarah took it carefully, noting the quality of the paper and the distinctive handwriting. She read it slowly, her expression changing from confusion to shock to disbelief as she processed each revelation. This can't be real," Sarah whispered when she finished reading. "Pete Rose? The Pete Rose? Mom, this has to be some kind of hoax, some cruel joke." Margaret showed her the key and explained about the trophy, watching as Sarah's skepticism gradually gave way to stunned acceptance. "Sarah, your father always said something didn't feel right about his father's death. He spent years trying to get more information, but the police files were incomplete, and everyone who was supposed to know something had either died or moved away or claimed they couldn't remember details." Sarah read the letter again, more slowly this time, paying attention to details she had missed in her initial shock. The handwriting was confident and mature, not the scrawl of someone playing a prank. The details about her family's history were too accurate, too specific to be fabricated by an outsider. "If this is real," Sarah said carefully, "it means Grandpa didn't just die in an accident. It means he died trying to help someone, trying to do the right thing. It means he was a hero. It means Pete Rose has been helping our family for decades, without us knowing," Margaret added, her voice stronger now that she had someone to share the burden with. "Remember when you needed money for college? Remember when we almost lost the house during the recession in '91? All those anonymous gifts, all those mysterious donations?" Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her teenage son, Jake. "Mom, when are you coming home? I need help with my history project on Vietnam." The irony of the timing wasn't lost on either woman. "I should call Tom," Sarah said, referring to her younger brother who lived in Denver and worked as a corporate accountant. "He needs to know about this too. This affects his understanding of our family history just as much as it affects mine." "Not yet," Margaret said firmly, her librarian instincts kicking in. "Not until we figure out what we're going to do. Tom has his own family to worry about, his own life to manage. This letter, it's going to change how he sees everything, how we all see everything. We need to be prepared for that." Sarah stood and walked to the window, watching the rain continue to fall on the familiar street where she had grown up. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had when she was a child, but everything felt different now. The foundation of her family's story had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to rebuild it. "Mum, what if we went to Las Vegas? What if we opened that safety deposit box? Maybe there are answers there. Maybe there are more pieces to this puzzle that could help us understand what really happened." "I'm too old for that kind of adventure," Margaret said with a weak smile, though there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes that hadn't been there since Robert's death. "Then I'll go. I can take a few days off from school. It's almost fall break anyway. Jake and Emma can stay with David." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the teacher in her recognizing the importance of gathering all available information before drawing conclusions. "Dad deserves to have his questions answered, even if he's not here to hear them." Margaret looked at her daughter with pride and a touch of concern. Sarah had always been the brave one in the family, the one who faced problems head-on rather than avoiding them. It was a quality that served her well as a teacher, but it sometimes led her into situations that were more complicated than she anticipated. "There's something else to consider," Margaret said quietly. "If this letter is real, if Pete Rose really has been helping our family all these years, then he's probably still alive. He might have more to tell us. He might have more answers about your grandfather." Sarah's eyes widened as she considered the implications. "We could find him. We could thank him. We could ask him about Grandpa William. We could finally get the whole story. Or we could leave the past buried," Margaret countered, playing devil's advocate despite her own curiosity. "Your father lived a good life not knowing this truth. He was happy, successful, loved. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay secret. Maybe some stones are better left unturned." Sarah shook her head decisively. "Dad spent his whole life wondering. He kept journals about his theories, Mom. He hired a private investigator in 1994. He never stopped looking for answers. He deserved to know the truth, and since he can't know it, we owe it to him to find out. We owe it to Grandpa William's memory." That evening, while Margaret prepared a simple dinner, Sarah called her family to explain that she would be taking a few days off for a family matter. Her husband David was supportive but concerned, wanting to know if everything was all right. Her teenagers were more interested in whether they could order pizza every night while she was gone. Though Jake showed some curiosity about the family mystery his mother was being deliberately vague about. "Just promise me you'll be careful," David said. "I know how you get when you're on a mission to solve something. Don't let this obsession take over your life the way your dad's search for answers sometimes did." Sarah promised to be cautious, but she could feel the familiar pull of a mystery that needed solving. As an English teacher, she had always been drawn to stories with missing pieces, narratives that didn't quite add up. This was like discovering that her own family's story had been missing its most important chapter. Margaret spent the evening looking through more of Robert's belongings, searching for any other clues about his father's death or the mysterious help their family had received over the years. She found a journal Robert had kept in the 1990s, filled with theories and questions about his father's death. April 15th, 1994, found Mum's old address book today. There are names in there I don't recognize, people who were supposedly friends with Dad. But when I try to track them down, they either don't exist or they claim they never knew William Thompson. It's like someone went through and created false names, false histories. Why would anyone do that unless they were trying to hide something? June 3rd, 1994, another anonymous donation to the church in Dad's memory. That makes 3 this year. Father McKenna says the money comes through a trust fund, but he doesn't know who set it up. Someone out there knows our family, knows our struggles, but they won't come forward. Why the secrecy? What are they hiding? August 12th, 1994. Talked to Officer Martinez again about Dad's accident report. He's retiring next month, and he finally admitted that there were things about the case that never made sense to him either. He said there were federal agents involved for a few days after the accident, asking questions that didn't seem related to a simple traffic fatality. Then suddenly the case was closed, and everyone was told to move on. Martinez thinks someone wanted the investigation to end quickly. November 18th, 1994. It's been 5 years since Dad died. I drove out to the crash site today, something I've never done before. The road is straight, well-maintained, good visibility. The weather wasn't bad that night. Dad was a careful driver who rarely drank and never took risks. How does someone like that just lose control of their car and hit a tree? The more I learn, the less sense it makes. February 7th, 1995. Mum died today. I hoped she might tell me something about Dad's last few days, some detail that could help me understand what happened. But she took whatever secret she had to her grave. I'm starting to think I'll never know the truth about how Dad really died. Margaret wiped away tears as she read her late husband's words. He had been so close to the truth, so close to understanding that his father's death wasn't the random accident everyone claimed it was. But without the letter from Pete Rose, he never could have put the pieces together. The journal entries continued for several more years, documenting Robert's frustration with dead ends and unanswered questions. Gradually, the entries became less frequent as he focused on building his own family and career. But he never completely gave up wondering about his father's death. July 4th, 1998. Watching Jake play Little League today reminded me of Dad. He loved baseball so much, and he was so proud when I made the All-Star team. I wonder what he would think of his grandson. I wonder if he's watching somehow. I've stopped actively investigating his death, but I've never stopped hoping that someday I'll get answers. Maybe the truth will surface when I least expect it. Margaret closed the journal, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Robert's hope for answers had been fulfilled just 27 years too late. The next morning, Sarah arrived early to help her mother pack for the trip to Las Vegas. They had decided to go together. Margaret wouldn't let her daughter face this alone, and Sarah wouldn't let her mother stay behind and wonder. It felt like the right thing to do, something Robert would have wanted them to do together. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Sarah asked as they loaded their small suitcase into her car. "We're about to open a door that can never be closed again. Once we know the truth, we can't unknow it." Margaret looked back at the house where she had lived with Robert for 35 years, where they had raised their children and built a life together. "Your father always said that the truth was worth pursuing, even when it was painful. He believed that understanding the past was the only way to make sense of the present. If we don't do this now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering, just like he did." As they drove toward the Cincinnati airport, Margaret clutched the letter and the key, feeling like she was carrying the weight of her family's hidden history. She thought about William Thompson, the grandfather her children had never known, and wondered what they would find in that safety deposit box in Las Vegas. "Do you think Pete Rose is a good man?" Sarah asked as they navigated the morning traffic. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think he's a man who made mistakes and has spent 30 years trying to atone for them. That doesn't erase the mistakes, but it says something about his character. Your grandfather obviously saw something good in him, something worth dying for. And if we find him, if we actually meet Pete Rose, what do we say to him? We thank him, Margaret said simply. We thank him for keeping his promise to your grandfather. We thank him for taking care of our family, and we forgive him for waiting so long to tell us the truth. Sarah nodded, but she could see the uncertainty in her mother's eyes. They were heading into unknown territory, pursuing answers to questions that had haunted their family for over 30 years. There was no guarantee that what they found would bring them peace, but they had to try. As their plane lifted off from Cincinnati, heading west toward Las Vegas, and the truth that waited for them there, both women felt the weight of the journey they were undertaking. They were about to discover secrets that would reshape their understanding of their family's history. Secrets that would connect them to a baseball legend and reveal the true heroism of a man they thought they had known. The adventure that lay ahead would test their courage, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately bring them face to face with the man who had been their family's secret guardian angel for over 3 decades. The flight from Cincinnati to Las Vegas felt longer than its actual 4.5-hour duration. Margaret gripped the armrest as the plane cut through turbulence over the Rocky Mountains, while Sarah reviewed the few documents they had brought with them. The letter, photocopies of Robert's journal entries, and the mysterious key that might unlock decades of family secrets. I keep thinking this is all a dream, Margaret said, staring out at the clouds below them. The landscape had changed from the rolling hills of Ohio to the flat plains of Kansas to the dramatic peaks of Colorado. 6 months ago, Robert was alive, and we thought we knew our family's story. Now everything has changed, and I'm flying to Las Vegas to meet a man I've only known as a baseball legend. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand reassuringly. Dad would be proud of us for doing this. He never gave up looking for answers about Grandpa William. In a way, we're finishing what he started. The other passengers on the flight were a mix of business travelers and tourists heading to Vegas for vacation. Sarah watched a young couple excitedly planning their itinerary, talking about shows they wanted to see and casinos they wanted to visit. Their innocent enthusiasm made her realize how strange her own mission must seem, flying across the country to meet a controversial baseball figure and uncover family secrets that had been buried for 3 decades. When they landed at McCarran International Airport, the desert heat hit them like a wall, even in October. Las Vegas sprawled before them in all its neon glory, a stark contrast to the quiet neighborhoods of Cincinnati. The city seemed to pulse with energy and possibility, but also with an underlying sense of desperation that made Margaret uncomfortable. They took a taxi to their hotel on the Strip, both women feeling out of place among the tourists and gamblers who filled the sidewalks. The taxi driver, a chatty man named Carlos, who had lived in Vegas for 20 years, pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about the city's transformation from a small desert town to an entertainment capital. "You ladies here for a show?" he asked as they sat in traffic near the Bellagio fountains. "We're here on family business," Sarah replied vaguely, not sure how to explain their real purpose. "Ah, family business in Vegas," Carlos chuckled. "That's usually either very good news or very bad news. Hope it's the good kind for you." Their hotel room overlooked the Strip, with a view of the dancing fountains at the Bellagio and the replica Eiffel Tower at Paris, Las Vegas. Margaret stood at the window, watching the crowds below, and wondered if Pete Rose was somewhere out there in the city, unaware that the Thompson family had finally discovered his secret. That evening, they sat in their hotel room planning their next moves. Sarah had called First National Bank and confirmed that Safety Deposit Box 1421 did exist and that they could access it with the proper key and identification. However, the bank employee had mentioned that the box was registered under multiple names, not just Pete Rose, but also William Thompson and something called the Thompson Family Trust. "That proves it," Sarah said excitedly, pacing around the small hotel room. "Grandpa was involved with Pete Rose, just like the letter says. They set up some kind of arrangement together." Margaret wasn't entirely convinced. "It proves they knew each other, but it doesn't prove anything else. What if we open that box and find something we don't want to know? What if there are more secrets, worse secrets?" Sarah stopped pacing and sat on the edge of the bed next to her mother. "Mom, we've come this far. We can't turn back now just because we're scared of what we might find. Dad lived his whole life with questions. Don't you want to finally have answers?" That night, Margaret had trouble sleeping. The unfamiliar sounds of Las Vegas, sirens, music, crowds of people, kept her awake. But more than that, she was anxious about what the next day would bring. She thought about Robert, wondering what he would have done in this situation. Would he have been excited to finally get answers, or would he have been apprehensive about disturbing the past? Around 3 a.m., she gave up trying to sleep and sat by the window, looking out at the city that never seemed to rest. Somewhere out there was a man who had carried the weight of her father-in-law's death for over 30 years, a man who had quietly helped her family through difficult times while remaining anonymous and unacknowledged. The next morning, they dressed conservatively and took a taxi to First National Bank. The building was modern and impersonal, all glass and steel and marble, nothing like the small community bank where Margaret had done business for decades in Cincinnati. The security was tight, with guards at the entrance and cameras everywhere. The customer service representative was a professional young woman named Jessica Martinez, who seemed genuinely interested in their unusual story once Sarah explained that they were there to access a safety deposit box that had been set up decades ago by a family member. "It's not often we see safety deposit boxes that old," Jessica explained as she led them through the security procedures. "This one was opened in 1993 and has been paid automatically ever since. The payment comes from a trust account that was established at the same time. The paperwork required to access the box was extensive. They had to provide multiple forms of identification, prove their relationship to William Thompson through death certificates and other documents, and sign several forms acknowledging that they were accessing the box at their own risk. The box hasn't been accessed in over 2 years," Jessica mentioned as she led them to the vault area. "Before that, it was opened annually, always by the same person, though I can't tell you who without proper authorization." In the secure viewing room, Jessica inserted their key along with the bank's master key, and the long metal box slid out smoothly. It was larger than Margaret had expected, about the size of a small filing cabinet drawer. "Take your time," Jessica said kindly. "Ring the bell when you're finished, and I'll come back to help you secure everything." Margaret's hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside were several manila envelopes, each labeled with dates spanning from 1993 to 2015. There was also a small wooden box, what appeared to be several personal letters, and a thick folder marked William Thompson Military Service Record. Sarah opened the most recent envelope first. Inside were bank statements showing regular deposits into an account established in Robert Thompson's name, deposits that explained the anonymous help their family had received over the years. The amounts varied, but they totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars over 2 decades. "My God," Sarah whispered as she calculated the numbers. "Pete Rose has been taking care of us all this time. This is more money than Dad made in 5 years of teaching." Margaret opened the wooden box with trembling fingers and gasped. Inside was a Purple Heart medal, still in its original case, along with a folded American flag and several military commendations. Underneath was a complete military service record for William Thompson, documenting his service in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970. "But Grandpa was never in the military," Sarah said, confused. "At least, nobody ever told us he was. Dad never mentioned anything about military service." Margaret unfolded the service record carefully, noting the official seals and signatures that proved its authenticity. William Thompson had been drafted in 1968, immediately after high school. He had served with distinction in Vietnam, earning not only the Purple Heart, but also a Bronze Star for valor and a combat infantry badge. He had been wounded twice, once seriously enough to require extended hospitalization. The record showed that William had served in the same region and time frame as Pete Rose, who had been drafted around the same time. There were even references to a specific incident where William had rescued fellow soldiers under enemy fire, earning his Bronze Star in the process. "This changes everything," Margaret said quietly. "Your grandfather wasn't just a mechanic who helped Pete Rose out of friendship. He was a combat veteran who saved lives in Vietnam. He was already a hero before he ever met Pete Rose." The personal letters were in Pete Rose's handwriting, but the paper was newer than the original letter they had found in Margaret's basement. These appeared to be updates, written over the years as Pete added to the contents of the safety deposit box. The first letter was dated 1995. "Robert, if you're reading this, it means you finally found the truth, or someone found it for you after you're gone. I've been updating this box for years, hoping someday I'd have the courage to tell you everything in person. Your father saved my life in Vietnam. We served in different units, but fate brought us together during one of the worst firefights of the war near Da Nang in March 1969. I was pinned down behind a destroyed tank, wounded and sure I was going to die when your father appeared out of nowhere. He dragged me to safety under heavy enemy fire, took shrapnel in his leg and arm doing it, but he never complained. We stayed in touch after the war. When I made it big in baseball, I tried to help him out, but William was proud. He didn't want charity. He was happy working as a mechanic, raising his son, living a quiet life. The only time he ever asked me for help was in 1989, when my gambling problems got out of control and some very dangerous people were threatening me. Your father offered to help me disappear for a while. He had contacts from his military days, people who knew how to make someone vanish without a trace. We planned to fake an accident, make it look like I had died so the men I owed money to would stop looking for me. But the people I owed money to were smarter than we thought. They figured out what we were planning. They killed your father to send me a message. They made it look like a car accident, but it was murder, plain and simple. They wanted me to know that nobody could hide from them, that even my friends weren't safe. I've lived with that guilt every day since. I paid off my debts eventually, but I could never bring your father back. All I could do was try to take care of his family the way he would have taken care of mine. The money in this account comes from my baseball memorabilia sales and personal appearances. It's not gambling money. I learned my lesson about that. It's clean money earned honestly, and it's my way of honoring your father's sacrifice. Pete Rose, 1995. A later letter was dated 2001. Robert, I saw in the Cincinnati paper that you got married to Margaret Sullivan. Your father would have been so proud to walk you down the aisle. I wanted to be there, to represent your father somehow, but I couldn't figure out how to do it without explaining everything. I've been watching your family from a distance for 12 years now. I know about your job at the high school, your love of coaching baseball, your dedication to your students. You're exactly the kind of man your father hoped you'd become. I've added more money to the account. Use it for your honeymoon, for starting your new life. Your father would want you to be happy. Pete. Another letter from 2008. Robert, I heard about your son Jake making the varsity baseball team. Your father would have been over the moon. I remember how proud he was when you played Little League. He carried pictures of you in your uniform everywhere he went. I've been thinking about telling you the truth for years now. Every time I see you at Reds games, yes, I see you there sometimes, sitting in the upper deck with your family. I want to walk over and introduce myself, but I'm a coward. I always have been. The account now has enough money to send both your children to college. It's what your father would have wanted. Impate, the most recent letter, was dated 2015. Robert, I'm getting old and I can't carry this secret much longer. Every day I don't tell you the truth is another day I dishonor your father's memory. He died a hero, and you deserve to know that. I've been banned from baseball for 26 years now, and I may never be reinstated, but that's not what keeps me awake at night. What haunts me is knowing that William Thompson died because of my mistakes, and his son never knew what kind of man his father really was. There's something else I need to tell you. The men who killed your father, I know who they were. I hired private investigators over the years, gathered evidence. I could have gone to the police, but they're all dead now. Heart attacks, cancer, old age. Justice has a way of working itself out sometimes. Your father died protecting me, just like he protected his fellow soldiers in Vietnam. He was a hero twice over, and I've been too much of a coward to tell you that. If you ever read this, I hope you can forgive me. Not for your father's death, I'll never forgive myself for that, but for keeping the truth from you for so long. Pete, Margaret and Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes after reading all the letters. The truth was more complex and painful than they had imagined, but it was also more beautiful. William Thompson hadn't just been an unlucky victim. He had been a decorated war hero who had died trying to help a friend, just as he had helped fellow soldiers in Vietnam. We need to find him, Sarah said finally, her voice thick with emotion. We need to find Pete Rose and tell him we don't blame him. We need to thank him for keeping his promise to our grandfather. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. Your grandfather was a hero, Sarah, a real hero, and Pete Rose has spent 30 years trying to make up for something that wasn't even his fault. They spent the rest of the afternoon examining the other contents of the safety deposit box. There were copies of newspaper articles about Pete Rose's baseball achievements, but also articles about his gambling scandal and ban from the game. There were photographs showing William Thompson and Pete Rose together, both in Vietnam and later in Cincinnati. In the pictures, they looked like brothers, two young men who had shared something profound and lasting. There was also a collection of items that William had saved for his son. Report cards, newspaper clippings about Robert's high school baseball career, even a letter William had written to Robert but never sent, dated just a week before his death. Son, I know I don't tell you often enough how proud I am of you. You're growing into a fine young man, and I see so much of your mother in your kindness and so much of myself in your determination. If anything ever happens to me, I want you to know that every decision I've made has been to protect you and your mother. Sometimes a man has to take risks to help a friend, even when those risks are dangerous. I've made arrangements to ensure you and your mother will be taken care of if I'm not around. Don't be too proud to accept help when it's offered. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to let others help you. Be a good man, Robert. Be better than your old man. Love your family, work hard, and remember that heroes aren't the people who never fall down. They're the people who get back up every time they fall. I love you more than you'll ever know. Dad. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before William's death. As they prepared to leave the bank, Jessica approached them with a business card and a knowing look. I probably shouldn't tell you this, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. But the man who set up this box still comes in occasionally to make deposits and check on things. He was here just last month, actually. He's an older gentleman, very polite, always asks about the box and whether anyone has ever come to claim it. Did he leave any way to contact him? Sarah asked hopefully. Jessica shook her head. Bank policy prevents me from sharing customer contact information, but... She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. If you're trying to find him, you might try the Bellagio poker room. A lot of the old-timers play there, and they know each other pretty well. Margaret and Sarah exchanged glances. After 34 years of secrecy, they were finally close to meeting the man who had been their family's secret guardian angel. That evening, they sat in their hotel room, surrounded by photocopies of all the documents they had found in the safety deposit box. The full scope of Pete Rose's dedication to their family was overwhelming. He had not only provided financial support, but had also carefully preserved William Thompson's memory and military honors. He kept everything, Margaret said, looking at photographs of Robert as a young man that she had never seen before. Every report card, every newspaper clipping, every achievement. He preserved Dad's entire childhood for him. Sarah was studying the military records, trying to reconcile this new image of her grandfather with the simple mechanic she had always imagined. Grandpa was wounded twice in Vietnam. He saved multiple soldiers under fire. He was a real war hero, and we never knew. Your father would have been so proud, Margaret said. He always felt like he came from ordinary people, but his father was extraordinary. He just never got the chance to know it. They decided to visit the Bellagio poker room the next day, hoping to find Pete Rose, or at least someone who might know how to contact him. It felt surreal to be actively seeking out a man who had remained hidden from them for so long, but they both felt a powerful need to complete this journey that Robert had unknowingly started years ago. As they prepared for bed, Margaret thought about the phone call she would eventually need to make to her son Tom in Denver. How do you tell your children that everything they thought they knew about their grandfather was wrong? How do you explain that a baseball legend has been their secret benefactor for decades? But those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, she was content to know that William Thompson had been a hero, that Pete Rose had honored his memory with decades of faithful service to his family, and that the truth, painful and complicated as it was finally coming to light. The Bellagio poker room hummed with quiet intensity the next afternoon, a world away from the flashing lights and ringing slot machines of the main casino floor. The room was dimly lit and professionally managed, with serious players hunched over green felt tables, their faces masks of concentration as they calculated odds and analyzed their opponents' tells. Margaret and Sarah sat at the elevated bar overlooking the tables, nursing coffee and watching the players with nervous anticipation. They had been there for 3 hours, and there was no sign of Pete Rose. The bartender, a friendly woman named Linda, who had worked there for 15 years, had been helpful but discreet when they asked about regular players. We get a lot of famous people in here, Linda had explained. Part of my job is to protect their privacy. But I will say that if you're looking for someone specific, afternoons and evenings are usually better than mornings. Margaret clutched her purse, which contained copies of all the documents from the safety deposit box. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say to Pete Rose, but now that the moment might be approaching, she felt tongue-tied and emotional. Maybe he's not coming today, Sarah whispered, checking her watch for the 20th time. It was almost 4 p.m., and their flight back to Cincinnati was scheduled for the next morning. Margaret studied the faces of the players below, looking for any sign of the man she had seen in countless photographs and television interviews over the years. Most of the poker players were middle-aged or older men, but none had Pete Rose's distinctive profile or bearing. A middle-aged man in a Bellagio uniform, probably a floor manager, approached their table. "Excuse me, ladies. I notice you've been here quite a while. Are you waiting for someone specific? Maybe I can help." Sarah hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "We're looking for Pete Rose. We have something very important to discuss with him. It's about our family. It's about my grandfather, William Thompson." The man's expression changed immediately from professional courtesy to genuine interest. "William Thompson from Cincinnati?" Both women nodded, surprised by the recognition. "Wait here," the man said. "Don't go anywhere. I'll see what I can do." 20 minutes later, Pete Rose himself walked into the poker room, moving more slowly than in his playing days, but still carrying himself with unmistakable dignity. At 84 years old, his hair was completely gray and thinning, but his eyes were still sharp and alert. He wore a simple navy blue polo shirt and khakis, looking like any other retiree, except for the way other people in the room glanced at him with recognition and respect. When he saw Margaret and Sarah sitting at the bar, he stopped in his tracks. For a long moment, he just stared at them, and Margaret could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. They looked like Robert, and Robert had looked like William. Margaret stood on shaky legs, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid everyone in the room could hear it. This was the man who had been secretly caring for her family for 3 decades, the man whose guilt had driven him to extraordinary acts of kindness and sacrifice. "Mrs. Thompson?" Pete's voice was gravelly but gentle, with the slight Cincinnati accent that had never left him, despite decades of living in other places. "Mr. Rose." Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. Pete gestured toward a quiet corner of the room, away from the active poker tables and curious onlookers. They sat in comfortable leather chairs that had witnessed countless conversations, but none quite like this one. "You found the letter," Pete said. It wasn't a question. He could see the answer in their faces, in the way they looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Margaret nodded and pulled the original letter from her purse, handling it carefully, as if it were made of glass. Robert never saw it. He died 6 months ago, still not knowing the truth about his father. Pete's shoulders sagged visibly, and for a moment he looked every one of his 84 years. The weight he had been carrying for over 3 decades seemed to settle on him like a physical burden. "I wrote that letter a dozen times over the years. I rewrote it, revised it, started over completely. I could never work up the courage to send it." "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice firm but not unkind. She had inherited her father's directness, along with his love of baseball. "Why did you carry this guilt for so long? Why didn't you tell us the truth about what kind of man our grandfather was?" Pete stared at his hands, which still bore the calluses of a lifetime of gripping baseballs and baseball bats. "Because your grandfather died saving me, and I spent the next 30 years being exactly the kind of man he tried to save me from becoming. I kept gambling after he died. I made more mistakes, bigger mistakes. I disappointed everyone who ever believed in me. How could I face his son and tell him his father died for someone who wasn't worth saving?" Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her librarian instincts taking over. "Mr. Rose, my husband spent his entire life wondering about his father. The not knowing ate at him like a cancer. Yes, the truth would have been painful, but not knowing was worse. He kept journals, hired private investigators, spent thousands of dollars trying to find answers that you could have given him with a phone call." "I tried to make it up to you," Pete said quietly, his voice thick with decades of unexpressed emotion. "The money, the help with college tuition, the house payments when Robert was unemployed. And we're grateful," Sarah interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "More grateful than you'll ever know. But Dad didn't need your money as much as he needed to know that his father was a hero. He needed to know that William Thompson died for something meaningful." Pete looked up, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "William was the best man I ever knew. In Vietnam, he saved my life without thinking twice about his own safety. When I was drowning in gambling debts years later, he offered to help without asking for anything in return. He was everything I should have been and wasn't. He was the kind of man who makes the world better just by being in it." Margaret pulled out the photographs from the safety deposit box, spreading them across the small table between them. "Tell us about him. Tell us about our William. Help us know the man we never really got to meet." For the next 3 hours, Pete Rose shared stories that brought William Thompson to life in ways that Margaret and Sarah had never imagined. He told them about William's dry sense of humor, how he could make even the most serious soldiers laugh with his perfect timing and understated delivery. He described William's incredible skill as a mechanic, not just with cars, but with any kind of machinery. He had kept their entire unit's equipment running in conditions that would have challenged professional engineers. He had this quiet wisdom, Pete said, his voice growing warm with memory. Other guys would panic in dangerous situations, but William would just assess the problem and figure out the solution. He never raised his voice, never got flustered. He was the guy everyone turned to when things went wrong because they knew he'd know what to do. Pete told them about William's letters home during the war, how he would spend hours writing to Robert and his wife Helen, describing not the dangers they faced, but the funny things that happened, the beautiful sunsets over the Vietnamese countryside, the bonds of friendship that formed between soldiers far from home. He talked about Robert constantly. Pete continued, pulling out his own worn wallet. From it, he withdrew a faded photograph of a young Robert in a Little League uniform. This picture was in your father's wallet when he died. He showed it to everyone, medics, other soldiers, even Vietnamese civilians when we were trying to establish friendly contact. He was so proud of that boy. Do you have other things? Sarah asked hopefully. Other memories of Dad's childhood that Grandpa shared with you? Pete nodded. Everything. I couldn't bring myself to give them to Robert because I'd have to explain how I got them. But I kept everything your father treasured. Pictures, letters your father wrote to him, even some of Robert's old baseball cards that William used to show off to anyone who would listen. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. Robert would have loved to know that his father was proud of him. He always wondered, you know. When you lose a parent young, you spend your whole life wondering if they would have been proud of the person you became. William would have been incredibly proud, Pete said firmly. Robert became exactly the kind of man his father hoped he'd become, dedicated to his family, committed to his community, someone who made a difference in young people's lives through teaching and coaching. There's something else, Pete said, his voice growing heavy with a different kind of pain. Something I didn't put in the safety deposit box because I wasn't sure you'd want to know. Sarah and Margaret exchanged glances, both wondering if there were more secrets, more painful truths to uncover. The men who killed your father, I know who they were. I hired private investigators, gathered evidence, built a complete case file. I could have gone to the police years ago, could have gotten justice for William. But they're all dead now, Margaret said, remembering what Pete had written in one of his letters. Pete nodded sadly. Heart attacks, cancer, old age, one car accident, time and karma caught up with all of them eventually. But for years, I had the power to make them pay for what they did to William, and I was too afraid to use it. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The weight of 34 years of secrets finally shared between them. The poker room continued its quiet activity around them, but their little corner felt separate from the world, a place where long-hidden truths could finally be spoken. Mr. Rose, Sarah said finally, my father lived a good life. He was a loving husband, a devoted father, and a respected teacher and coach. Yes, he wondered about his grandfather, but that wondering didn't diminish his happiness. The curiosity drove him to be a better historian, a better researcher, a better teacher. And the help you provided, it made so many things possible for our family. Pete looked surprised, as if he had expected anger or resentment instead of gratitude. You don't hate me? You don't blame me for your grandfather's death? Margaret laughed softly, the sound mixing sadness and relief in equal measure. Hate you? Mr. Rose, you've been like a guardian angel to our family. You've honored William Thompson's memory in the most beautiful way possible. You kept your promise to a dying friend for over 30 years. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to be proud of. But I was a coward, Pete insisted, his voice breaking slightly. I should have told Robert the truth years ago. I should have let him know what kind of man his father was, instead of hiding in the shadows. Maybe, Sarah agreed gently, but you were also human. Grief and guilt make people do strange things, make choices that seem right at the time, but look different years later. What matters is that you never forgot your promise to our grandfather. You never stopped caring for his family, never stopped honoring his memory. Pete reached into his jacket and pulled out his worn leather wallet again. From it, he withdrew another faded photograph, this one showing Robert at about 16, playing American Legion baseball. This is Robert making the game-winning hit in the state championship. Your grandfather was so proud when Robert's team won that tournament. Margaret took the photograph with trembling hands. It was a picture she had never seen, showing her late husband as a young man with his whole life ahead of him, captured in a moment of triumph that his father had treasured. There are more, Pete said quietly. Boxes of photographs, letters, memorabilia, things your grandfather collected about Robert that he made me promise to give him someday. I've been carrying that promise for 34 years, waiting for the courage to fulfill it." Sarah smiled through her tears. "We'd love to have them. But more than that, we'd love to hear more stories about our grandfather. Would you consider coming to Cincinnati, meeting the rest of our family? My brother Tom, my children?" Pete looked startled, as if the idea of being welcomed into their family was completely foreign to him. "You'd want that? After everything I've done? Everything I've failed to do?" Margaret nodded firmly. "Mr. Rose, you're part of our family's story. You've been part of our family for 30 years, even though we didn't know it. It's time we made it official. It's time you stopped hiding in the shadows and let us thank you properly. Besides," Sarah added with a slight smile, "my son Jake is 17 and plays baseball. He'd probably faint if he met Pete Rose. And my daughter Emma pretends she's not interested in anything old people do, but she loves family stories. They both deserve to know about their great-grandfather's heroism." Pete sat quietly for a long moment, considering their invitation. For 34 years, he had been an outsider looking in on the Thompson family, helping from a distance but never belonging. The idea of actually being welcomed into their home, their lives, seemed almost too good to be true. "I'd like that," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that very much. But are you sure? I'm not exactly a popular figure these days. My reputation—" "Your reputation with us is that of a man who kept his word to a dying friend for over 30 years, Margaret said firmly. "That's all we need to know about your character." As they prepared to part ways, Pete pulled out his phone and programmed his number into Sarah's phone, and she did the same for him. After decades of secrecy, they were finally able to communicate directly. "There's one more thing," Pete said as they stood to leave. "Your grandfather's grave. I've been taking care of it all these years, making sure it's maintained, leaving flowers on his birthday and the anniversary of his death. I hope that's okay." Margaret felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Even in death, Pete had been honoring William Thompson's memory. "Of course it's okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything." As they walked toward the exit, Pete called after them. "Mrs. Thompson, Sarah, your grandfather would be so proud of both of you. The courage it took to come here, to seek out the truth. That's exactly the kind of bravery William had." Margaret turned back to look at him one more time. "So do you, Mr. Rose. So do you." 3 weeks later, Pete Rose's black sedan turned onto Elm Street in Cincinnati, carrying him back to the city where his professional baseball career had begun and where William Thompson had lived and died. The October leaves had reached their peak colors, painting the quiet residential street in brilliant shades of red, gold, and orange. Pete sat in the passenger seat, while his longtime friend and assistant, Danny Rodriguez, navigated the familiar Cincinnati streets. "You sure about this, Pete?" Danny asked, as he slowed down to check house numbers. "You've been avoiding this conversation for 34 years. That's a lot of weight to carry into one afternoon." Pete stared out the window at the modest 2-story houses that lined the street, each with its own small front yard and carefully maintained garden. This was the neighborhood where Robert Thompson had lived and raised his family, where Pete's financial assistance had helped keep a mortgage current during difficult times, where children had grown up and gone to college, partly because of anonymous scholarships from a guilt-ridden baseball player. "I've been putting this off for 34 years, Danny. It's time to stop being a coward." Danny parked under the same maple tree where Sarah had parked that rainy night when everything changed. "What if they change their minds? What if seeing you in person makes it all too real?" Pete adjusted his tie and checked his appearance in the car's mirror. He had dressed carefully for this meeting, choosing a conservative navy suit that made him look more like a retired businessman than a controversial baseball figure. "Then I'll accept that, but I owe it to William to try." The front door of 1247 Elm Street opened before Pete could ring the bell. Margaret Thompson stood there, wearing a simple blue dress and a welcoming smile that immediately put Pete at ease. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she had the kind of warm, intelligent eyes that reminded Pete why Robert had grown up to be such a good man. Behind her stood Sarah and her family. Her husband, David Miller, a quiet man who taught history at the local community college, and their teenage children, Jake and Emma. Also present were Tom Thompson, Robert's younger brother, who had flown in from Denver with his wife Linda, and their twin 16-year-old daughters, Ashley and Brittany. "Mr. Rose," Margaret said, extending both hands to clasp his in a gesture that was both formal and genuinely affectionate. "Welcome home." The word home hit Pete harder than he had expected. For decades, he had felt like an outsider looking in on the Thompson family, helping from the shadows but never belonging. Now, standing on their front porch on a crisp autumn afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete acceptance. Inside, the house was everything Pete had imagined it would be: warm, comfortable, and filled with the evidence of a family that had been deeply loved and carefully nurtured. Robert's baseball memorabilia was displayed throughout the living room, not expensive collectibles, but personal treasures that told the story of a man's lifelong love for the game. Pete noticed a shadow box containing Robert's high school baseball glove and some faded team photographs hanging prominently on the wall. "These are beautiful," he said, studying the display with genuine interest. "Your father had good hands. I can tell from the way he wore his glove." "Dad treasured these things," Sarah explained, standing beside Pete as he examined the memorabilia. "He always said baseball connected him to his father, even though he never got to see Grandpa William play." Pete smiled, his expression growing soft with memory. "Your grandfather was actually a pretty good ball player himself. He played semi-pro for a couple of years before he got drafted for Vietnam. He had a good arm and could hit for average. He might have gone further if the war hadn't interrupted everything." Jake Thompson Miller, Sarah's 17-year-old son, stepped forward with the careful politeness that teenagers use when meeting adults they're not sure how to address. "Mr. Rose, I know about you from school. You're Charlie Hustle, right? The guy who broke Ty Cobb's record?" Pete's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Despite all his troubles and controversies, he still loved talking to young people about baseball. "That's right, son. Though these days I hustle a lot slower than I used to. Do you play?" "Varsity shortstop," Jake said with growing confidence. "Coach says I might get a scholarship if I keep working." "Your great-grandfather would be proud," Pete said seriously. He always believed that baseball taught young men about life, how to handle success and failure, how to work as part of a team, how to never give up even when you're behind. Emma Miller, 15 and typically more interested in her social media than family conversations, looked up from her phone with curiosity. "Are you really famous? Like, actually famous? Emma!" Sarah scolded. But Pete laughed, a genuine, warm sound that filled the room. "It's okay. Yes, I'm famous, though maybe not always for the right reasons. I made some big mistakes in my life, ones that hurt a lot of people, but I've been trying to make up for them ever since." Margaret had prepared a feast that reminded Pete of family dinners from his childhood. Pot roast with vegetables, homemade bread, apple pie that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and comfort. As they gathered around the dining room table, Pete found himself sitting in the chair that had been Robert's, surrounded by the family that had become the focus of his secret generosity for over 3 decades. Tom Thompson, who had inherited his father's analytical nature along with his dedication to family, raised his glass of water in a toast. "To William Thompson, a war hero we never really knew, but who clearly raised incredible sons and left a legacy of heroism and sacrifice that continues to this day." "To Robert," Pete added, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted his own glass. "A man who would have been proud to know the truth about his father and grateful for the family that loved him so completely." After dinner, Pete presented the Thompson family with the boxes of memorabilia he had carefully preserved all these years. There were hundreds of photographs spanning Robert's entire childhood and adolescence, report cards saved in chronological order, newspaper clippings from every athletic achievement, and letters written in William Thompson's careful handwriting. Margaret gasped when she found a letter addressed to Robert, but never sent, written just days before William's death. "My dear son, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me, and I won't be there to guide you through the rest of your journey to manhood. I want you to know that being your father has been the greatest honor and joy of my life. The war changed me in ways I'm still understanding, but watching you grow up has healed parts of me that I thought were broken forever. Your curiosity, your kindness, your determination to always do the right thing, these qualities make me believe that the future will be better than the past. I've made arrangements with a trusted friend to look after you and your mother if something happens to me. Don't be too proud to accept help when it's offered. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to let others support you. Be a good man, Robert. Be better than your old man. Love your family deeply, work with integrity, and remember that heroes aren't the people who never fall down. They're the people who get back up every time they fall and help others do the same. I love you more than words can express. I'm proud of you already, and I know I always will be. Your father, William Thompson." The letter was dated November 15th, 1989, just 3 days before William's death. Jake, who had been quietly examining some of the baseball memorabilia, suddenly looked up with barely contained excitement. "Mr. Rose, could you maybe sign something for me? I have one of your baseball cards upstairs." Pete smiled broadly. "I'd be honored, son, but I have something even better for you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a baseball, not just any baseball, but one from his record-breaking 4,092nd hit, the moment when he surpassed Ty Cobb to become baseball's all-time hits leader. "This ball has been sitting in a safe in Las Vegas for 25 years, Pete said as he took out a pen and began signing the baseball with a personalized message. "I was saving it for something special, for the right moment. I think this qualifies." Jake's eyes went wide as he carefully accepted the baseball, reading the inscription, "To Jake Thompson Miller, your great-grandfather was a hero, and heroes run in families. Keep swinging. Pete Rose, 4192. "Are you sure?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This must be worth—" "It's worth exactly what it means to you," Pete said firmly. "Your great-grandfather would have gotten a huge kick out of knowing his great-grandson had that ball. He would have carried a picture of you, holding it in his wallet right next to the one of your dad." Emma, who had been pretending to be unimpressed by the baseball talk, surprised everyone by approaching Pete with her phone. "Could you maybe sign my phone case? If that's not too weird. My friends are never going to believe I met you." Pete carefully signed the pink phone case, adding a message about the importance of family and always being proud of where you come from. Emma's facade of teenage indifference cracked completely as she beamed at the personalized autograph. As the evening wound down and the extended family shared stories and looked through photographs, Pete found himself alone with Margaret in the kitchen while the others examined more memorabilia in the living room. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, drying dishes as she washed them in a scene of domestic normalcy that felt both foreign and wonderful to him. "I need you to know something. The money, the help over the years, it wasn't charity, it was a debt, a sacred debt I owed to the finest man I ever knew." Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face him directly. "Mr. Rose, you've spent 34 years punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. William chose to help you because that's the kind of man he was, someone who helped friends in trouble. He died because evil people made evil choices, not because you asked for help." I just wish I'd been brave enough to do it all openly," Pete said, his voice heavy with decades of regret. "I wish Robert could have known where the help was coming from, could have known it was his father's friend honoring his memory." Margaret smiled with the wisdom of someone who had lived through decades of marriage and motherhood. "Sometimes the most important gifts are the ones given in secret, without expectation of recognition or gratitude. You gave us exactly what we needed, when we needed it, without asking for anything in return. That's not cowardice, Mr. Rose. That's love. That's the purest kind of love there is." Pete felt tears threatening to spill over as he processed her words. For so many years, he had seen his actions as inadequate penance for an unforgivable failure. But Margaret was offering him a different perspective, one in which his decades of quiet service represented something beautiful rather than something shameful. "William would be proud of you," Margaret continued, placing a gentle hand on Pete's arm. "He would be proud that you kept your promise, proud that you took care of his family, and proud that you finally found the courage to tell us the truth." As Pete prepared to leave, the entire Thompson family gathered on the front porch. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of burning leaves from somewhere in the neighborhood. The streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the quiet residential street. "This doesn't have to be goodbye," Sarah said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had found missing pieces of her family's puzzle. "You're welcome here any time. You're family now, officially family." Tom, who had been quiet for most of the evening, spoke up with the careful consideration that characterized everything he did. "Sarah's right. You've been part of our family for 30 years without us knowing it. Now that we do know, we want to make it official. Would you consider spending Christmas with us? Linda makes an amazing turkey, and the girls would love to show you around Denver." Jake, still clutching his signed baseball like a treasured artifact, looked up at Pete with the hero worship that only teenagers can manage. "And maybe you could write to me sometimes? Tell me more stories about great-grandpa? I'm doing a family history project for school, and now I have so much more to write about." Even Emma, who had spent most of the evening trying to look bored, stepped forward with surprising sincerity. "Yeah, and maybe you could come to one of Jake's games sometime? I bet he'd play way better if Pete Rose was watching." Pete looked around at these people who had every right to resent him, but instead had welcomed him with open arms and generous hearts. Tom's invitation to Denver for Christmas, Jake's request for ongoing correspondence, Emma's suggestion that he attend Jake's baseball games, these weren't polite gestures made out of obligation. These were genuine invitations from people who wanted him to be part of their lives. "I'd like all of that," Pete said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I'd like that more than I can tell you." Danny started the car's engine, but Pete rolled down his window as they prepared to leave. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, wanting to say something that had been on his heart all evening. "Yes, Mr. Rose? Your husband was exactly the kind of man his father raised him to be. William Thompson's legacy lives on in Robert's children and grandchildren. You should be very proud of the family you built together." Margaret waved as the black sedan pulled away from the curb. "So should you, Mr. Rose. So should you." As they drove through the quiet Cincinnati streets toward Pete's hotel, Danny glanced at his longtime friend and employer. "How do you feel?" Pete was quiet for a long moment, watching the familiar city pass by outside his window. "Lighter," he said finally. "For the first time in 34 years, I feel lighter." "So what happens now?" Pete smiled, a genuine peaceful expression that Danny hadn't seen on his face in years. "Now I get to be part of a family again. Now I get to honor William Thompson's memory openly instead of hiding in the shadows. Now I get to watch Jake play baseball and help him understand what his great-grandfather was really like. And the guilt, the regret?" Pete considered the question carefully. "It'll always be there. I can't change what happened to William, can't bring him back or undo my mistakes, but maybe the guilt doesn't have to be punishment anymore. Maybe it can be motivation to keep being the kind of man William believed I could become." Later that night, Margaret sat in Robert's chair, surrounded by the photographs and documents Pete had left behind. There was her husband as a baby, chubby and smiling in his father's arms. There was William in his army uniform, young and serious and impossibly handsome. There were pictures of father and son together, building memories that had lasted far beyond death. She picked up the phone and called Sarah, who answered on the first ring. "Mom, are you okay? How are you feeling about everything?" "I'm perfect, honey. Better than perfect. I just wanted to tell you that your father would have loved today. He would have been so happy to finally know the truth about his father. So proud to know that William Thompson was a genuine American hero. And he would have been amazed to know that Pete Rose, his childhood idol, had been watching over our family all these years," Sarah added. "It's like something out of a movie, isn't it?" Margaret smiled, looking at a photograph of William and Pete together in Vietnam, two young men who had no idea how their friendship would echo through the decades. "It's better than a movie, Sarah. It's real. It's our family's story, and finally we know all of it." Over the following weeks, the Thompson family began integrating Pete Rose into their lives in ways both large and small. He called Jake twice a week to talk about baseball technique and share stories about William's athletic abilities. He sent Emma books about women in sports history, encouraging her to find her own passion the way her great-grandfather had found his. Pete attended Jake's final baseball game of the season, sitting in the stands with Margaret and cheering as Jake made a diving catch that would have made his great-grandfather proud. After the game, Pete spent an hour talking with Jake's teammates, signing autographs and sharing wisdom about sportsmanship and perseverance. True to his word, Tom invited Pete to spend Christmas in Denver. Pete flew out on December 23rd, carrying carefully wrapped presents for everyone, including a framed photograph of William Thompson in his army uniform that he had restored and enhanced by a professional photographer. On Christmas morning, as the extended Thompson family gathered around Tom's tree to exchange gifts, Pete presented Margaret with a special surprise: William Thompson's original Purple Heart medal, which he had kept safe in Las Vegas for over 30 years. "This belongs with his family," Pete said as Margaret opened the small velvet box with trembling hands. "William earned this medal saving other soldiers' lives in Vietnam. He was a hero long before he ever tried to help me." Margaret held the medal carefully, feeling the weight of her father-in-law's sacrifice and courage. "We'll display it with honor," she promised, "and we'll make sure Jake and Emma and Tom's girls know exactly what kind of man their great-grandfather was." Pete also gave Jake something even more precious, a handwritten letter that William had started writing to his son just days before his death, but had never finished. Pete had found it among William's personal effects and had kept it safe for decades, waiting for the right moment to share it. "My son Robert, tomorrow you turn 15, and I want you to know that watching you grow up has been the greatest privilege of my life. You're becoming the kind of young man who makes his father proud every single day. I see so much of your mother in your kindness, and so much of myself in your determination. But you're also becoming your own person, with your own dreams and your own strength. That's exactly as it should be. I hope I'll be around to see you graduate, to see you fall in love, to see you build a family of your own. But if something ever happens to me, I want you to know that you're already everything I hoped you'd become. Keep playing baseball, son. The game will teach you about life in ways that nothing else can. And remember that heroes come in all sizes. Sometimes the biggest hero is just someone who does the right thing when nobody is watching. Happy birthday, Robert. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Dad. The letter was dated November 17th, 1989, just 2 days before William's death. As the Thompson family read William's final words to his son, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Pete himself was crying openly, finally able to share the burden of these precious memories with the people who loved William Thompson most. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, holding the letter as if it were made of glass. "Thank you for keeping all of this safe for us. Thank you for taking care of our family all these years." Pete hugged the young man, seeing William's strength and Robert's kindness reflected in the next generation. "It was my honor, son. Your great-grandfather saved my life, and in return, I got to be part of the most wonderful family I've ever known." Later that evening, as the family sat around the fireplace sharing stories and making plans for the new year, Pete realized that his long journey through guilt and shame had finally led him home. Not to a place, but to a family that had accepted him completely, despite his flaws and failures. Margaret, watching Pete laugh at one of Tom's stories while Emma showed him something on her phone, felt a deep sense of completion. Her husband's lifelong questions had finally been answered, her father-in-law's heroism had finally been recognized, and their family had gained a new member who would help ensure that William Thompson's legacy lived on for generations to come. The lost letter had indeed changed everything, not just by revealing the truth about the past, but by opening the door to a future filled with new relationships, deeper understanding, and the kind of love that transcends time and circumstance. As Pete Rose settled into his place in the Thompson family, he finally understood what William had tried to tell him all those years ago in Vietnam. Heroes aren't perfect people who never make mistakes. Heroes are ordinary people who keep trying to do the right thing, even when it's difficult, even when it takes decades to find the courage. William Thompson had been a hero in war and in peace. Robert Thompson had been a hero to his students and his family. And maybe, just maybe, Pete Rose had found a way to be a hero too, not on a baseball field, but in the quiet, daily work of keeping promises and honoring the memory of the finest man he had ever known. The story that began with a lost letter in a dusty basement had become something much more beautiful, a story about redemption, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. It was a story that would be told and retold in the Thompson family for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the most important truths take decades to surface. But when they finally do, they have the power to change everything.